There are people in this world who wear their damage on the outside, who carry their violence close to the surface, where others can see it, and calibrate their distance accordingly. And then there are people whose damage is so thoroughly interior, so completely walled off from the face they present to the world, that the world never calibrates anything at all. It simply opens its doors. It offers its trust. It smiles back. Ted Bundy was the second kind of person, and it is this fact, more than any other single thing about him, that makes his story as disturbing to sit with now as it was in the years when he was still moving freely through the country, through the mountains and the college towns and the quiet neighborhoods, leaving nothing behind him that the people who knew him could later point to and say, "Yes, that was the sign, that was the moment I should have known." He was handsome. This detail has been repeated so many times in accounts of Bundy that it risks becoming meaningless, a kind of shorthand for the larger point rather than the point itself. But it matters, concretely and specifically, because it was a tool, as surely as anything he carried in the bag, he kept in the back of his car. He had the kind of face that people trusted instinctively, open and symmetrical, with dark eyes that could be warm when he needed them to be warm, and he had studied the art of being trusted with the same intensity that other people study for professions, the same focused attention to detail, the same willingness to practice. He knew how to listen. He knew when to laugh. He knew how to make a woman feel seen in the specific way that women in their 20s in 1974 were rarely made to feel seen, which is to say, genuinely, attentively, as if her opinion mattered and her presence was something he was grateful for. He had the gift, and it was a gift he understood consciously and deployed deliberately, of making people feel that they were the interesting one in the room. He was also, and this is the fact that lives alongside the handsomeness in a way that never stops being cold, a man who killed women, who had been killing them, or something very close to it, for years before the first confirmed murder, who would kill them across 6 states and 2 escapes from custody and a decade of sustained investigation, who would in the end confess to 30 murders, while investigators believed the true number to be higher, who would die in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on the 24th of January, 1989, at 7 in the morning, while a crowd outside the gates cheered. The story of Ted Bundy is a story about the failure of appearance, about the way the most dangerous things can hide behind the most reassuring surfaces. It is also, and this is the part that the cheering crowd outside the prison perhaps did not fully attend to, a story about victims. About 30 confirmed women, each of them a specific person, with a specific history and a specific future that was taken from her in circumstances of terror and violence. The names and the faces and the particular details of those specific lives are the moral weight the story carries, and they should not be lost in the long, fascinating, and genuinely unnerving shadow that Bundy himself still casts across the decades since. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on the 24th of November, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His mother was a 22-year-old woman named Eleanor Louise Cowell, known to the family as Louise, who had conceived him under circumstances she would not fully disclose even many years later. The identity of his father was, and has remained, a subject of speculation and disagreement. For years, the family maintained the fiction that Louise's parents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, were his parents, and that Louise was his sister. Ted Bundy grew up believing his grandparents were his mother and father. He was 3 or 4 years old when the family moved from Vermont to Philadelphia, and then, a short time later, to Tacoma, Washington, where Louise eventually met and married a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook who adopted young Ted and gave him the surname he would carry through the rest of his life. The household in Tacoma was, by most accounts, a stable and conventional working-class family. Johnny Bundy was, by all available evidence, a decent and well-meaning man who tried to build a relationship with his stepson and had difficulty doing so. The difficulty, in Bundy's later tellings of his own childhood, came from him, not from the household. He described feeling separate, different, observing his family and his neighbors and his schoolmates from some interior distance that he could not close. He described finding, by the time he was in early adolescence, knives, which he collected and carried. He described, with less frequency but unmistakable weight, in the accounts that survive from his later years when he spoke more freely about himself, a fascination with violent imagery, with images of harm, that emerged very early, and that he recognized even then as something he should keep hidden. The question of what made Ted Bundy is one that criminal psychologists and biographers have pursued for decades without producing a consensus answer, because the honest answer is that we don't know, and probably can't know, and may never be able to know, because the mind that would have been required to fully understand it was the mind we are trying to understand. Bundy himself was not a reliable narrator of his own history. He was a sophisticated self-presenter who understood very well that his own story was material he could shape and deploy for various audiences, and he did so throughout his life, including in the extensive interviews he gave to researchers in the years before his execution, interviews in which he spoke about his crimes in the detached, analytic third-person language of a psychology student discussing a case study rather than a man discussing what he had actually done. What we can say with confidence is that the outward arc of Bundy's youth and early adulthood was one of conventional aspiration and partial success. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese. He volunteered for the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission. He worked on a crisis hotline. He was involved, for a period, in Washington State Republican Party politics, and impressed the people he worked with there enough that a senior party figure later wrote him a letter of recommendation for law school. He worked for the Washington State Governor's office. He was, in short, on an upward trajectory that the people around him found entirely plausible, because he worked at making it plausible, and because the face he showed them gave them no reason to look elsewhere. He had a girlfriend, a woman from a comfortable Seattle family with whom he had a serious relationship that he eventually ended without clear explanation, leaving her devastated and confused. Several researchers have noted that the girlfriend bore a striking physical resemblance to many of his later victims, and have suggested that the dynamic of control and abandonment in that relationship left marks on his psychology that found their eventual, terrible expression in what followed. Bundy himself, in some of his later interviews, was evasive about the relationship in ways that seemed to suggest it mattered to him in some fashion he was not willing to fully examine. But the explanatory weight that has been placed on this relationship, on the idea that a romantic rejection was in some meaningful sense the origin of what followed, risks replacing a more uncomfortable truth with something more narratively satisfying. The truth, as much as it can be known, is that whatever drove Bundy was older and deeper and more interior than any single relationship, that the face he showed his girlfriends and his political colleagues and his professors and his neighbors was a construction that had been built, carefully and over many years, over something that he himself described, when he came closest to describing it honestly, as a force that lived alongside him and that he fed rather than resisted. The murders began, by the best available evidence, in Washington State in 1974. There may have been earlier victims. Bundy suggested in some of his most candid late interviews that the violence did not begin in 1974, that the impulses that led to murder had found other expressions before that year, and investigators examining cases from the late 1960s and early 1970s in the Northwest have identified several unsolved murders and disappearances that may belong to his history. But what can be documented with reasonable confidence begins in January of 1974 in Seattle, in a room in a house near the University of Washington campus. Sharon Clarke was 18 years old and a student at the University of Washington. On the night of the 4th of January, 1974, she was asleep in her bed in the basement bedroom of a house she shared with several other women on the block known as Greek Row, near the university campus. She did not wake. Someone entered the room through a window or a door in the night and attacked her with a metal rod from her bed frame, causing injuries that left her in a coma. She survived. She was found the following morning by her housemates, and she survived with injuries that would affect her for the rest of her life. The person who attacked her was never caught. Linda Ann Healy was 21 years old, a student at the University of Washington and a part-time radio broadcaster who gave ski reports on a local radio station. On the 1st of February, 1974, a month after Sharon Clarke was attacked less than a mile away, Linda Healy disappeared from her basement bedroom in a house on North 12th Street in Seattle. Her housemates noticed the following morning that she had not appeared for breakfast, something unusual enough to cause concern. When one of them went to check on her, the bed appeared to have been made, which was odd because Linda had not been seen making it. When the bedclothes were pulled back, there was blood on the pillow and on the sheets. Her nightgown was hanging in the closet. Her backpack was gone. She was gone. Her skull was found more than a year later on Taylor Mountain, east of Seattle, with the skulls of 3 other young women. In the months that followed, a pattern developed across the Seattle area and its surrounding suburbs that at first registered as a series of unrelated disappearances. Young women, most of them college students, most of them white, most of them with long hair parted in the middle, in the particular style that the early 1970s favored, began to vanish from parks and campuses and neighborhoods. Donna Gail Manson, 19, disappeared on the 12th of March while walking from her dormitory to a concert on the Evergreen State College campus in Olympia. Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared on the 17th of April from the Central Washington State College campus in Ellensburg. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, disappeared on the 6th of May from the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis. Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared on the 1st of June from a tavern near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Georgianne Hawkins, 18, disappeared on the 11th of June from the alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington, a busy area on a warm evening, with people present within shouting distance. The pattern was there, for investigators who were trying to see it, but the infrastructure for seeing patterns across multiple jurisdictions in 1974 was primitive, almost beyond modern comprehension. There was no national database of missing persons. There was no computerized system for cross-referencing cases. Information traveled between law enforcement agencies slowly and inconsistently, through telephone calls and paper correspondence, and the personal relationships between individual detectives who happened to know each other. The woman who disappeared in Corvallis was, to the investigators in Corvallis, a missing person. The connection to the women who had disappeared in Seattle and Ellensburg was a thing to be suspected and discussed, but not yet confirmed, not yet acted on with the kind of unified force that the emerging reality of the situation deserved. On the 14th of July, 1974, at a state park and beach called Lake Sammamish State Park, east of Seattle, the pattern declared itself openly enough that it could no longer be interpreted as coincidence. On that single Sunday afternoon, 2 young women disappeared from a crowded public beach in broad daylight. Janice Ann Ott, 23, was approached by a man who introduced himself as Ted and asked for her help loading a sailboat onto a car. She was seen leaving with him. She did not return. Denise Marie Naslund, 19, disappeared from the same park later that afternoon, from within a group of friends. At least 5 women later came forward to say that they too had been approached by a man named Ted that day at Lake Sammamish, a man with his arm in a sling and sometimes on crutches, a man with a European sports car, a man asking for help with a boat. Those women had said no, or had walked away, or had been with companions when he approached. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund had, for whatever particular constellation of circumstance and character and chance that day had arranged, said yes. A composite sketch was produced and circulated. The name Ted was in the newspapers. People in the Northwest began to talk about Ted, about the Ted killings, about whether the man at the beach and the man who had taken the other women were the same person, about what it meant that a man could walk into a crowded park and take a woman in full view of others. The police received thousands of tips. Among the names that were called in, more than once, from more than one person, was the name of Theodore Bundy. He was looked at briefly, and then not followed up on with sufficient urgency, because there was no framework yet for understanding what they were dealing with, because the other tips were equally unfolded, because the investigative resources were already strained past their capacity, and because Theodore Robert Bundy, when checked against the usual indicators of criminal risk, did not fit the profile anyone had in mind. He was a law student. He had excellent references. His record was clean. He had a girlfriend and an apartment and aspirations toward a career in public service. He was, by every visible measure, someone the machinery of suspicion was not built to catch. In the autumn of 1974, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, to begin law school at the University of Utah. The murders in the Pacific Northwest stopped. The murders in Utah began. Nancy Wilcox, 16, disappeared on the 2nd of October from Holiday, Utah. Melissa Ann Smith, 17, the daughter of Midvale's chief of police, disappeared on the 18th of October from Midvale and was found 9 days later in the mountains east of Salt Lake City. Laura Ann Amey, 17, disappeared on the 31st of October, Halloween night, while hitchhiking near Lehigh. On the 8th of November, a woman named Carol Daronch narrowly escaped. She was approached in a shopping mall parking lot in Murray, Utah, by a man identifying himself as a police officer who told her that someone had attempted to break into her car and that he needed her to accompany him to the station to file a report. She got into his car. He drove erratically, and when he stopped the car and tried to handcuff her and came at her with a crowbar, she fought her way out of the vehicle and was rescued by a passing couple. She gave police a description and later identified Bundy in a lineup. The handcuffs she had broken free of were never fully explained by the man who had put them on her. That same evening, a 17-year-old girl named Deborah Jean Kent disappeared from outside a high school auditorium in Bountiful, Utah, where she had gone to watch her brother in a school play. A handcuff key was found in the parking lot afterward. In Colorado, the murders continued into 1975. Karin Aileen Campbell, 23, disappeared from the corridor of the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village on the 12th of January, while her fiancé and his children waited in their room. Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared in March from Vail. Denise Lynn Oliverson, 24, disappeared in April from Grand Junction. Shelley K. Robertson, 24, disappeared in July from Golden. And then, on the 16th of August, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving with its headlights off in a residential neighborhood in the early morning hours. He ran the plates. The car turned out to belong to Theodore Bundy, a law student. When Hayward pulled it over and searched it, he found inside what he would later describe as A kit, a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, and strips of torn sheeting. Bundy explained that the mask was for skiing and that the other items were unremarkable. He was arrested on suspicion of burglary, the most they could make stick at that moment. Carol Daronch identified him in a lineup. He was charged with kidnapping. He was convicted in March of 1976 and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. Colorado then moved to charge him with the murder of Karen Campbell. He was extradited to Colorado to face trial. And then, on the 7th of June 1977, Ted Bundy jumped out of a second-story window of the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, during a recess in his own court proceedings. He had been granted the unusual privilege of acting as his own counsel, and the privileges that came with that arrangement had given him access to the law library unsupervised. He ran into the mountains. He was recaptured 8 days later, weak and disoriented, and, investigators believed, genuinely surprised at how difficult survival had proven in the Colorado high country. He was taken back to the Glenwood Springs jail to await trial. On the night of the 30th of December, 1977, Ted Bundy escaped again. He had spent months quietly and methodically making himself thinner through diet, exploiting a gap in the supervision of his cell to enlarge a hole in the ceiling above his bunk, and on that night he climbed through it, made his way through the building's infrastructure, and left. It was 15 hours before his absence was noticed. He made his way to Chicago by plane, then to Atlanta, then to Tallahassee, Florida, where he rented a room under a false name near the Florida State University campus, and began what he would later describe as an attempt to build a new life, a period of staying quiet, of not acting on what he felt. The period lasted a few weeks. In the early hours of the 15th of January, 1978, Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through an unlocked back door. What happened inside that house between approximately 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning resulted in the deaths of 2 young women and the severe injury of 2 others, all within the space of perhaps 20 minutes. Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, were killed. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner survived with serious injuries. A 5th woman in another part of the house heard what she described as a thudding sound and did not investigate. Across town, another woman named Cheryl Thomas was attacked in her apartment the same night and survived with grave injuries. The violence at the Chi Omega house was of a character that shocked even experienced investigators. Evidence of an attack conducted with a ferocity that several of them later said was unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. The house had been full of women. Several of them had been awake. Nita Neary, returning home in the early morning, had entered the house and seen a man moving in the shadows and been frightened enough to lock herself in a bedroom and wake a friend. She had seen enough of him to later provide a description that proved useful. On the 9th of February, 1978, in Lake City, Florida, a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Diane Leach left her junior high school classroom to retrieve a purse she had forgotten and did not come back. She was found 7 weeks later in a state park nearby. She was Ted Bundy's last known victim. He was arrested on the 15th of February in Pensacola by a police officer named David Lee, who pulled over a Volkswagen Beetle operating with stolen plates and found, in the driver, a man who gave a false name and then, when his real identity was established, turned out to be the person whose escape from the Colorado jail had been national news. Bundy fought with the officer during the arrest. When he was subdued and the officer asked him why he had run, Bundy said, "I wish you had killed me." He was tried twice in Florida. The first trial, for the Chi Omega murders, was held in Miami in the summer of 1979 and was televised nationally, becoming the first major American criminal trial to be broadcast in this way, a media event of an order that the country had not previously experienced in a courtroom, and one whose effects on how Americans understood and consumed criminal proceedings are still being worked out decades later. He entered the courtroom each day immaculately dressed, working his way through the complicated legal machinery of the trial with a competence that his own attorneys privately acknowledged was genuine, jousting with the prosecution in language that was occasionally almost impressive, and maintaining throughout the performance a quality of controlled theatricality that observers found deeply unsettling precisely because it seemed to come so naturally to him. The evidence against him was devastating. Bite mark evidence introduced by the prosecution, the result of impressions taken from Lisa Levy's body, was matched by a forensic odontologist to impressions taken from Bundy's teeth, a comparison that the jury found, along with the eyewitness accounts and the physical evidence recovered from the scene, sufficient to convict. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. A separate trial on the murder of Kimberly Leach produced a second death sentence. He spent 9 years on death row at Florida State Prison in Rayford, filing appeal after appeal, exhausting the legal avenues available to him with the same methodical intelligence he had applied to everything else in his life. He gave interviews to researchers. He spoke with FBI agents. He became, in those years, something that he had always in some ways been preparing to become, a subject of serious psychological study, a case that the emerging field of criminal profiling needed to understand, and could only understand by sitting down with him and asking the questions and accepting, with appropriate skepticism, whatever answers he chose to give. The most significant of these conversations were conducted by investigators from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, Robert Keppel and William Hagmaier, among others, men who were in the process of developing what would become the foundational methodology of criminal profiling, who needed to understand how a person like Bundy thought, how he selected his victims, how he approached them, what he told himself about what he was doing. Bundy was, in these conversations, a careful and sometimes brilliant discussant, willing to engage with the psychological questions with a sophistication that was in some ways more disturbing than outright hostility would have been, because it demonstrated, conversation by conversation, that the intelligence that had made him such an effective predator was fully intact, was in fact operating at a high level even in the circumstances of his confinement. He spoke, in these conversations and in others he gave to journalists and academics, in a characteristic way about the violence, using the third person or the passive voice, describing what had happened as if describing events that had occurred to someone he had observed, rather than someone he had been. He called the part of himself that killed an entity or a phenomenon, something that existed alongside the Ted Bundy that others knew and that operated with its own logic and its own momentum. This framing has been analyzed extensively, and the analyses arrive at various places. Some researchers believe it represented a genuine dissociative experience, a psychological split between his presented self and the self that acted. Others believe it was a sophisticated rhetorical strategy, a way of discussing what he had done without fully accepting its implications, while still appearing candid enough to be worth talking to. Probably both things were true simultaneously. Bundy was not a person in whom sincerity and performance were ever cleanly separable. He also claimed, in these final years, that pornography was the origin and fuel of his violence, that the consumption of violent sexual imagery in adolescence had set him on the path that ended in 30 confessed murders. He made this claim most emphatically in a televised interview with the Christian broadcaster James Dobson, conducted the day before his execution, an interview that has been understood by most serious researchers not as a confession of psychological truth, but as a final performance, a last attempt to control the narrative of his own life by offering an explanation that was simple enough to be digestible, and that, by locating the origin of his violence in an external source, subtly deflected the full weight of his own agency. The pornography theory has not been supported by the broader body of research into the causes of sexual violence, and the FBI investigators, who knew Bundy best, found his last-day attribution both convenient and, at least in its totality, unconvincing. The morning of the 24th of January, 1989, arrived with a quality that those who were present have described as strange, the kind of electric and almost festive atmosphere that capital punishment produces in its observers, an atmosphere that sits uneasily alongside any serious consideration of what is actually happening, regardless of one's position on the question. Several hundred people had gathered outside the prison gates the previous night, some in the kind of revelry that the occasion seemed to have licensed, with T-shirts and bumper stickers and chants. Inside the prison, the machinery of execution was proceeding with its own grim procedural logic. Ted Bundy was pronounced dead at 7 o'clock in the morning. He had confessed, in his final weeks, to 30 murders across 7 states. He gave enough specific detail about enough of those murders to convince investigators that most of his account was substantially true, though the full number of his victims remains unknown and may, investigators have said, be higher than 30 by a margin that cannot now be determined. Several of the families of his victims declined to be in Florida for the execution. Several others attended. The question of what closure means, what it looks like, what it actually does for people who have lost someone to a violence as specific and as total as the violence Bundy visited on his victims, is one that resists easy answer and probably always will. What Bundy left behind him, beyond the grief of those families and the absence of the women he killed, was something more diffuse and more culturally enduring. A template. Not a template for violence exactly, but a template for understanding a specific kind of violence, for approaching a specific kind of predator, for building the investigative and psychological architecture that might allow law enforcement to see what the investigators of 1974 could not quite see in time. His case was central to the development of criminal profiling as a formal investigative discipline. The conversations that FBI agents had with him on death row contributed directly to the methodology used in the Behavioral Science Unit's landmark study of serial killers, which in turn informed the development of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, a national database designed to connect crimes across jurisdictions of precisely the kind that had allowed Bundy to move between Washington and Utah and Colorado and Florida without triggering the pattern recognition that might have stopped him sooner. He taught law enforcement how to look at a crime scene and reason backward toward a perpetrator. He taught them what the organizational capacity of a particular crime suggested about the psychology of the person who committed it, what the selection of victims revealed about fantasy and compulsion and calculation. He taught them, in the specific and terrible example of his own history, why the handsome young man who volunteered at the crisis center and worked for the governor's office and impressed everyone he met was not someone who should have been dismissed so quickly in 1974, why the absence of conventional criminality in someone's background was not the same thing as the absence of danger. He also taught the culture something, though this part of the lesson is more ambiguous and more troubling. He taught the culture that serial murder was cinematic, that it came with a face worth looking at and a story worth following, that the psychology of extreme violence was inherently fascinating rather than inherently repugnant. The media coverage of his trial, the national broadcast, the way the cameras lingered on his face, and the journalists competed for access, and the audience followed along at home, with something that was not entirely unlike the engagement they brought to television drama, established patterns of coverage and consumption that have shaped the true crime genre for the decades since. Patterns that have proven both productive in the sense of driving genuine public interest in issues of criminal justice and victim advocacy, and deeply problematic in the sense of frequently elevating perpetrators at the expense of victims and treating violence as entertainment. The women who died deserve better than to be secondary figures in the story of the man who killed them. This is a thing that is easy to say and difficult to fully execute, because the historical record is itself shaped by the same imbalances of attention. Bundy's name is documented in enormous detail: his childhood, his psychology, his crimes, his trials, his death row interviews, his execution morning. The lives of his victims are known to us in fragments, in the formal grief of a police missing persons report, and the informal grief of the remembrances published by their families decades later. The record is what it is, and the effort to correct for its imbalances requires something more than a note of intention. It requires, at minimum, the insistence that each of the women he killed was a full person with a full interior life, with relationships and ambitions and fears and humor and the particular, irreplaceable quality that each human being has and that cannot be reconstructed from a photograph or a brief biographical note, with a future that was taken from her by a man who had made the calculation that she was available to him, and who was right, and who was never held accountable for any of the murders with full legal force until Florida did what Washington and Utah and Colorado had not been able to do in time. Linda Ann Healy wanted to work in radio. Susan Rancourt was a pre-med student who was described by friends as fiercely intelligent and deeply kind. Jorgen Hawkins, who disappeared from the alley behind her sorority house on a warm June evening, had been on the telephone with her boyfriend minutes before she vanished, and the call was so ordinary, so full of the texture of a normal Tuesday night, that its ordinariness is one of the details that stays longest after you set the account down. Melissa Smith was 17, and the daughter of a police chief who spent the rest of his career and the rest of his life partly defined by what had been done to his daughter. Laura Aime was 17 and had gotten into a dispute with her parents and was hitchhiking, the way teenagers hitchhiked in 1974, without understanding that the calculation of risk they were making with every ride they accepted had changed in ways that were only just becoming visible. Karin Campbell was a nurse from Michigan who was on vacation in Colorado with her fiancé and his children, who walked down a hotel corridor for a magazine and did not come back. Carol Darronch, who survived, whose escape was narrow enough that the word survival still sits in the mouth in an uncomfortable way, spent years afterward living with what she had survived in, trying to understand how she had gotten into that car and what would have happened if the strength of her body and the chance of the passing couple on the street had not been precisely what they were. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were killed in their beds. Kimberly Leach was 12 years old. 12 years old, and she walked back to her classroom to get her purse, and she did not get there, and for 7 weeks, her family and her community did not know where she was or what had happened to her, and then they knew. These are the facts that the celebrity of Ted Bundy sometimes displaces, the specific weight of specific loss that his name, spoken as it still is in every true crime forum and every documentary and every podcast and every college criminology lecture, sometimes obscures. He has become, in the decades since his execution, something close to a cultural archetype: the handsome serial killer, the charming predator, the monster in the suit, a figure who appears and reappears in American storytelling with a frequency that reflects both the genuine fascination of his psychology and the culture's complicated relationship with violence when it wears a presentable face. Actors have played him in multiple films and series. His letters have been published. People who were pen pals with him have given interviews. The volume of material produced about him since his death would fill a very large library, and within that library, the voices of the women he killed occupy a very small shelf. Part of what makes the Ted Bundy case so persistently difficult to think about clearly is that it exists at the intersection of several different kinds of horror, and those horrors pull in different directions. There is the horror of the violence itself, which was real and was targeted and was suffered by specific people. There is the horror of the failure of the systems that should have protected those people, the failure of the pattern recognition that might have caught him sooner, the failure of the institutional coordination that allowed him to move across state lines without being identified until Carol Deronch identified him in a lineup, the failure that allowed him to escape not once, but twice, while in legal custody. There is the horror of what he represented psychologically, the demonstration that the face we trust most, the face that is most legible to us as human and relatable and safe, can be a surface that covers something entirely opposite. And there is the horror, perhaps the most quietly persistent of all these, that lies in the question of how many there were. 30 confessed. Possibly higher, investigators believed, significantly higher. When Bundy was in his final weeks, and the executions were approaching, and his options were fully exhausted, he began to confess in more detail, offering information about cases and locations in exchange for stays that were not, in the end, granted. He identified specific locations. He described specific crimes. Some of the information led to remains that had not previously been found, and some of it has still not been verified. There are families, right now, in the present tense, who do not know whether the woman they lost in the 1970s was one of Bundy's victims, who have no certainty about what happened, who carry the specific uncertainty of that particular kind of loss, which is not grief exactly, because grief requires a confirmed ending, but something more corrosive, a permanent suspension between knowing and not knowing. DNA technology has changed and is still changing what can be done with the physical evidence that survives from the 1970s cases, and there are researchers and investigators who believe that over the coming years, a clearer picture of the full extent of Bundy's crimes may emerge from the evidence that persisted. Whether it does or not, whether the number is 30 or 40 or higher, what will not change is the essential character of what happened. A man identified a specific kind of person as available to him, as accessible and vulnerable, and he pursued that person with planning and patience and the specific social intelligence that the world had always rewarded him for, until the pursuing produced what it was always going to produce, and then he moved on to the next. The question that haunted investigators in 1974 and haunts researchers in the present is the question of how a person becomes what Ted Bundy became, and what, if anything, could have been done about it, and what, if anything, can be done about people who are becoming it right now, in houses and apartments and dorm rooms and offices that look exactly like everyone else's, that offer no visible indication of what is developing inside them. The criminal profile that emerged from the Bundy interviews and from the broader study of which he was a part has been refined and expanded and debated in the decades since, and the behavioral scientists who have built on that foundation are considerably better equipped than their predecessors to identify certain warning patterns, certain markers in early behavior and psychology that correlate with the development of the specific kind of predatory violence that Bundy represents. But the honest assessment, from the people who have spent careers studying this question, is that prediction remains enormously difficult, that the population of people who exhibit warning signs is vast, and the population of people who go on to kill is small, and that the specific alchemy of factors that produces a Ted Bundy, rather than simply a deeply troubled and antisocial person who never kills, is not yet understood well enough to catch reliably before it is too late. The tools are better. The coordination is better. The databases that did not exist in 1974 now exist, and they do the pattern recognition that the investigators who were trying to connect the dots between Olympia and Ellensburg and Corvallis could not have done by hand. Whether they would have been enough in 1974 to stop him before the summer of that year, before Lake Sammamish, before he moved to Utah, is a question that cannot be answered. What can be answered, with more confidence than most of the questions this case raises, is the question of what it means for our understanding of danger. Ted Bundy's primary weapon was not the rod he carried, or the cord he used, or the car he drove. His primary weapon was the expectation, shared by nearly every person he ever encountered, that a person who looked like him and talked like him and presented himself the way he presented himself was not something to be afraid of. The weapon was the trust that the culture had trained the people around him to extend, and the specific vulnerability of the people he preyed on, young women moving through the world with the ordinary and necessary assumption that most of the people they encountered meant them no harm. Every awareness campaign that followed the Bundy case, every self-defense class and stranger danger warning and instruction in the specific mechanics of what someone like Bundy would say when he approached you in a parking lot, was in some sense a response to the demonstration he had provided of how precisely that trust could be exploited. The culture learned something from him, or tried to. It is harder to be certain that what it learned was the right lesson, because the right lesson, the lesson that Carol Daronch and the women at Lake Sammamish and the women who said no when he approached them tried to teach, is not a lesson about staying alert to danger in parking lots. It is a lesson about the structural vulnerability of people who have been given fewer protections and fewer resources and fewer options, who move through the world with more exposure and less margin, and who become available to predators in ways that are not simply about individual awareness and individual response, but about the shape of the society in which they live. The women who died were vulnerable in specific, structural ways that had nothing to do with their individual choices or their individual failures to recognize danger. They were vulnerable because they were young and female, and often alone, in ways that the world did not adequately protect. The question of how to change those structures, how to build a world in which the vulnerability that Bundy exploited is less ambient and less accepted, is considerably harder than the question of how to train people to recognize a man with his arm in a sling asking for help with a boat. It is also considerably more important. Ted Bundy was pronounced dead at 7 in the morning on the 24th of January, 1989. He was 42 years old. He left behind him 30 confessed murders, a number that serious investigators do not believe is complete, and a trail of cases across 7 states that will likely never be fully accounted for. He left behind him families who have been living in his wake for 50 years, whose grief has been complicated and sometimes re-traumatized by the ongoing cultural appetite for the story of the man who killed their daughters and sisters and mothers. He left behind him a field of criminal psychology that is fundamentally shaped by the effort to understand him, and a set of investigative tools and procedures that came directly from the recognition of what those investigators had failed to see in 1974. He also left behind something harder to name, something that his face still produces when it appears in a documentary or a photograph, a reaction that is not quite fear and not quite fascination, but something between them, a recognition that the most dangerous thing is rarely the thing that looks dangerous, that the face most worth being cautious about. This is the lesson that is easiest to articulate and most difficult to live by, because it runs against everything the social animal that humans are has evolved to prefer. We are built for trust. We are built to extend the benefit of the doubt to faces that seem familiar and intentions that seem legible. The people who prey on this are not common, but they exist, and they have always existed, and they look, more often than the comfortable story would prefer, exactly like everyone else. That is what the autumn of 1974 in Seattle, and the winter in Salt Lake City, and the spring in Vail, and the January night in Tallahassee, and every other stop on the route that Bundy's violence carved through the American landscape of the 1970s amounts to, finally, in the settled light of decades of distance. Not a story about a monster, because the word monster lets us off the hook, lets us place him outside the range of the human, and therefore outside the range of what the human world is responsible for producing and enabling, and failing to stop. Not a story about charm and handsomeness, and the seductive surface of evil, because that framing keeps the camera on him, where he always wanted it. A story about 30 women and the futures they deserved and did not get, about the systems that failed them and the people who were trying to catch the thing moving toward them without quite knowing what it was, about the long and continuing work of making the world safe enough that the Carol Duranches of every generation don't have to rely on the chance of a passing car and the strength of their own arms to survive a Tuesday night in November. The case is closed. In the legal sense, the man was caught and tried and executed, and the sentence was carried out, and whatever justice that represents, however inadequate and however belated, was delivered. But the questions it leaves open, the structural questions and the psychological questions, and the questions about 30 women whose full lives deserve to be in the record, alongside the exhaustive documentation of the man who ended them, those questions are not closed. They remain open, and they are worth sitting with, in the specific discomfort that this particular story produces in anyone who approaches it with the seriousness it requires. Somewhere, in a storage facility, the case files sit in their boxes, and the photographs of the evidence, and the interview transcripts, and the maps of the mountain locations where remains were found, and the coroner's reports, and the letters Bundy wrote from death row in his careful, controlled hand. And somewhere in the sense in which the particular losses that shape families and communities persist across generations, the absence of Linda Healy, and Donna Manson, and Susan Rancourt, and Roberta Parks, and Brenda Ball, and Jorgen Hawkins, and Janice Ott, and Denise Nasland, and Nancy Wilcox, and Melissa Smith, and Laura Amy, and Karen Campbell, and Julie Cunningham, and Denise Oliverson, and Shelley Robertson, and Margaret Bowman, and Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach, and confirmed and unconfirmed, named and unnamed, is still present in the lives of the people who loved them, in the particular shape of what those lives became after the summer of 1974, after the note on the door that said she never came home, after the phone call that said they had found something, after the long years of not knowing, and then having to go on knowing. Ted Bundy wanted, in the end, to be a story. He worked at it his entire life. He succeeded, in a way that should make us uncomfortable, because the story that followed him was exactly the story he would have written if he could have, the story that kept him at the center, that treated his psychology as the horizon to be reached, his face as the one worth looking at. The correction to that story is not to make him smaller or less comprehensible, but to insist, against the gravity of his notoriety, that the center of this story is not him. It never was. It was the women. It is still the women. It should always have been the women. And if we have learned anything in the half-century since the summer of 1974, it should be that. To understand the full shape of what Ted Bundy was, you have to understand the Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s, and the particular quality of the world that formed the backdrop of his early crimes. The Pacific Northwest in 1974 was a place of extraordinary natural beauty and a particular kind of social openness, a region that had been shaped by the counterculture movements of the late 60s into something more trusting, more communal in its instincts, more inclined toward the kind of easy sociability between strangers that was, in that particular historical moment, coded as progressive and good. Hitchhiking was normal. Getting into cars with people you did not know was normal. The specific social warmth that allowed a young man to approach a woman on a beach and ask for help with a sailboat, and have that request accepted without suspicion was a feature of the culture, not a deficiency in the individual judgment of the women who accepted it. This cultural context matters because it has been too often used as a kind of retroactive criticism, as if the openness of the early 70s was a mistake that the women who lived within it should have corrected in the specific instances of their own interactions with Bundy. They should not have been required to correct for it. The responsibility for what happened lay entirely with one person, and that person spent years cultivating the appearance of trustworthiness, precisely because he understood that it would disarm the caution that more overtly threatening people would trigger. The Pacific Northwest's openness was not a failure of the culture. It was a virtue that was exploited by someone whose relationship to the social contract was entirely performative, who had learned its vocabulary and its gestures without ever genuinely accepting its obligations. Bundy's understanding of social performance was the product of years of careful observation and practice. His early education, his work in politics, his time on the crisis hotline, all of these were opportunities to study how people presented themselves and how others responded, to catalog the specific signals of trustworthiness and competence and warmth, and to reproduce them with the fidelity of a skilled mimic. Former colleagues in the Washington State Republican Party recalled him as charming and capable, someone who understood instinctively how to calibrate his manner to different audiences. Former supervisors at the crisis hotline, perhaps the most disturbing of his early associations, given what we now know, recalled him as an empathetic and effective counselor, someone who genuinely seemed to understand how to talk to people in distress. The dissonance of that image, Ted Bundy on a telephone, counseling someone through a crisis, is not comfortable to sit with, and should not be. It is the same dissonance that runs through every account of him as a colleague, a student, a boyfriend, a political volunteer. He was, in each of these roles, genuinely useful, genuinely skilled, genuinely the thing he appeared to be, which is to say, genuinely capable of performing the role. What could not be seen, what no one around him found a way to see, was what the performance was concealing, what lived alongside the charm and the competence and the attentive eyes. Ann Rule was working at the same crisis hotline as Bundy in the early 70s. She was also a crime writer who would go on to write one of the most important books about him, The Stranger Beside Me, a book that draws its title from her personal experience of having known him, of having sat beside him on those telephone shifts, of having found him funny and considerate and genuinely good company. She has described, in interviews about the book and the experience of writing it, the specific and sustained difficulty of reconciling her memory of the person she knew with the person the evidence showed him to be. She never found a way to fully reconcile them, because they cannot be fully reconciled. They were both real. They were both true. That is what makes the story what it is. The crisis hotline detail is one of several in Bundy's biography that have a specific, cold irony to them. He studied psychology at the University of Washington. He worked in victim advocacy. He wrote a pamphlet on rape prevention. These are not details that should be taken to imply that he was, in some carefully constructed way, placing himself close to the systems he was exploiting, though the profiling literature does note that some perpetrators of this type are drawn to roles that give them access to vulnerable people and to information about how vulnerability is identified and responded to. They should be taken, more simply and more uncomfortably, as evidence of how completely the performing self can coexist with what it is performing over, how a person can sit in one room being genuinely helpful and useful and return to another room and be something else entirely without the people in the first room ever knowing the second room exists. The law school chapter of his life, his time at the University of Utah, adds another layer of irony that his captors, judges, and the jury that eventually convicted him were acutely aware of. He knew the law. He had studied it, was studying it, when the Utah authorities arrested him, and he used that knowledge throughout his legal proceedings in ways that complicated and slowed the process. His decision to represent himself at various points during his trials was understood at the time as a strategic calculation, a choice to keep himself at the center of the courtroom's attention and to use the platform his own defense provided. Several legal observers who followed the proceedings believed he was in fact capable of performing this role at a level that, in different circumstances and on behalf of a different client, would have been considered impressive. The same intelligence that made him such an effective predator in the field made him, under the strange conditions of his own murder trial, a genuinely challenging legal opponent. The courtroom was where the performed self had its last major stage. Bundy understood courts the way he understood rooms full of people, as environments where appearance and manner mattered as much as content, where the impression made on the people watching shaped their assessment of everything else. He dressed carefully. He maintained composure at moments when composure required real effort. He made jokes at appropriate moments. He was, to the television cameras that broadcast his Miami trial to a national audience, unmistakably present, unmistakably a person rather than an abstraction, and this presence was precisely the problem, precisely the thing that made the coverage so uncomfortable to watch, even in retrospect. He was interesting on camera. He was watchable. And 30 women were dead, and the cameras found him interesting anyway. The FBI agents who conducted the most extensive interviews with him on death row have written and spoken at length about the specific experience of sitting with him, of maintaining the kind of controlled engagement that the research required without losing sight of what was being engaged with. Robert Keppel, the detective who had led the early investigation in Washington and who came back to interview Bundy in the late 1980s, described the experience in his book The Riverman as consistently and quietly unnerving, not because Bundy was overtly frightening, but because of the gap between the social intelligence on display in the conversation and the knowledge of what that social intelligence had been used for. Bundy was helpful in the interviews, genuinely helpful, in the sense that the information he provided was real and led to things that investigators could verify and act on. He discussed the psychology of violence with a fluency that was simultaneously useful and deeply disturbing, describing how selection worked, how approach worked, how the specific mechanics of trust and disarmament functioned, in the language of someone who had conducted a great deal of research on the subject through direct and terrible personal experience. He never, in any of these interviews, expressed what the people sitting across from him would have recognized as genuine remorse. He expressed, occasionally, a kind of regret that seemed to be about himself rather than about his victims, a sorrow for the entity or the phenomenon that had controlled him, for the situation he found himself in, for the narrowing of options that death row represented. The researchers who spoke with him noted this consistently: the absence of the specific empathy, the ability to fully inhabit another person's experience and recognize its violation, that genuine remorse requires. This absence is itself significant, and has been part of the evolving clinical understanding of the specific personality structure that characterizes perpetrators of this type, the particular combination of social intelligence and emotional vacancy that allows a person to master the performance of empathy while remaining entirely disconnected from the actual experience of it. The state of Florida executed him because it had convicted him and sentenced him, and because the appeals had run out, and because the governor signed the warrant, and because on the 24th of January, 1989, at 7 in the morning, the sentence was carried out. What justice this represented is a question that belongs to the families of his victims to answer, not to the documentary frame, because justice of this kind is personal in ways that institutional language does not adequately capture. Some families have said the execution gave them something, some resolution, some closing of a specific kind of open chapter. Others have said it gave them nothing, that the man's death could not return what his life had taken, that they found themselves waiting for some feeling that did not arrive. Grief that has been structured by violence and sustained by uncertainty for years does not resolve easily, and the machinery of capital punishment is not designed for grief. It is designed for something else, something more institutional and less human, and the two purposes, whatever they share, are not the same. What persisted after the execution, and what persists now, is the record, the case files and the court transcripts and the interview recordings and the photographs and the FBI research that his interviews contributed to, and the cold case reviews that have continued in multiple states in the decades since. The record is extensive and in some ways still growing, still being added to as DNA technology produces new possibilities for verification and identification. As families who have spent decades without answers pursue the specific and very difficult question of whether the woman they lost was one of the 30 or one of the unknown additional number. The cultural record persists too, and is in some ways the most complicated legacy to navigate, because the cultural record has given Ted Bundy a kind of immortality that sits in profound tension with the reality of what he did. He is a character now, as well as a person, and the character has escaped the specific gravity of the facts, in ways that the facts have not yet fully reclaimed. He appears in movies and series as a dark romantic figure, as an anti-hero, as the fascinating monster, and each of these appearances regenerates the celebrity that he cultivated so carefully in life, and that serves, in ways both subtle and obvious, to center him in a story whose center should be elsewhere. The women who were his victims have not been given equivalent cultural treatment. There are no films in which the full humanity of Linda Healy or Jordan Hawkins or Melissa Smith is explored with the depth and detail that has been applied to the man who killed them. There are no prestige productions that follow the full arc of their lives before the specific evening that ended them, that give the audience time enough with them as people to feel the specific weight of what was lost. This is a failure of the culture's attention, and it is worth naming directly because the correction to it is not impossible, and because the correction matters both as a matter of justice and as a matter of accurate historical understanding. The story of the Bundy murders is not a story about Ted Bundy. It is a story about 30 women and the world that made them vulnerable, and the failure of the systems that should have protected them. Ted Bundy is the mechanism by which that story was delivered, but he is not the story. The investigative lessons that came from the case have been integrated so thoroughly into law enforcement practice that it is now difficult to fully appreciate what was absent before them. The development of BCAP, the National Database for Violent Crime, was directly motivated by the recognition that Bundy's ability to move between jurisdictions had been a structural advantage that no amount of individual detective brilliance could have overcome without better information infrastructure. The database exists now, and it functions, and it has contributed to the identification of patterns in violent crime across state lines that would previously have taken years to recognize, if they were recognized at all. The development of the formal criminal profile, the behavioral science unit's methodology for reasoning from crime scene evidence to perpetrator psychology, is also a direct descendant of the Bundy case and the interviews it produced. These things are not small legacies. They represent a genuine and lasting improvement in the investigative capacity of American law enforcement, built partly on the willingness of the men who interviewed Bundy to sit with what they were sitting with long enough to learn from it. Whether those improvements have been enough, whether they would have stopped someone like Bundy in 1974, or whether they would stop someone like him today, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty and probably should not be answered with overconfidence. The tools are better. The frameworks are better. The willingness to see a pattern across jurisdictions, to name a series of connected crimes before the body count demands it, is greater now than it was 50 years ago. But the fundamental challenge, the challenge of finding a person who is presenting a thoroughly convincing version of normalcy while harboring something entirely opposed to it, is not a challenge that any database or profile can fully resolve. It is a challenge that lives in the gap between the performance and the reality, in the space that Ted Bundy occupied for decades, and that space is, by its nature, very difficult to illuminate from the outside. The autumn comes back every year to the Pacific Northwest. The leaves turn and the rain begins, the particular gray Seattle rain that is less a downpour than a permanent mist, and the campuses fill with students who have no direct memory of 1974, who know the name Ted Bundy the way they know the names of other historical events, as information rather than as living memory. The houses where the women lived, the streets where they disappeared, the parks and the mountains where the investigation searched, still exist and carry in their specific geography the residue of what happened there in a way that the people who live near them are sometimes aware of and sometimes entirely not. The campus of the University of Washington is beautiful in the autumn, leafy and active, and full of the noise of young people conducting the ordinary business of being young. On a warm evening in June, the alley behind a sorority house would be busy with the sound of people coming and going, conversations through open windows, the general ambient life of a community in motion. Jorgen Hawkins walked down that alley on the 11th of June, 1974, and did not reach the end of it. The alley is still there. The mountains east of Seattle, where the search teams went in 1975 after the first remains were found and where they found the skulls of 4 women on Taylor Mountain, are still there. Cascade Range does not change on the human timescale, or changes so slowly that the change is invisible to any given generation. The mountains were there in 1974, and they are there now, and they will be there when the last person with any living memory of the case is also gone, holding in their specific geography whatever the earth absorbed in those years, holding it in the way the earth holds everything, quietly and without judgment and without the possibility of testimony. The story ends where it ends, with a death sentence carried out and a case never fully completed, with a body count that is probably higher than 30 and cannot be determined with certainty, with families who have been living in the wake of specific losses for 50 years, with a set of investigative tools built partly on what the case taught and a cultural fascination that shows no sign of diminishing, and with 30 names and the 30 lives those names represented, lives that were cut short by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and who chose, every time the choice presented itself, to do it. The names are the moral weight the story carries. They should be the last thing spoken and the first thing remembered. Linda Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Jorgen Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Aimee, Carol Daronch, who survived, Shuli Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Shelley Robertson, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Karen Chandler, who survived, Kathy Kleiner, who survived, Cheryl Thomas, who survived, Kimberly Leach, and others, unnamed, unconfirmed, still waiting in the gap between what is known and what can be established. They were people, full, specific, irreplaceable people, each of whom had a morning the day before she died, in which she made coffee and thought about something she needed to do, in which she called someone she loved or thought about calling them, in which she existed in the ordinary, full-dimensioned way that we exist in our own lives and rarely think to name, because naming it requires the kind of attention that usually only loss teaches us to pay. They deserved the lives they were going to have. They deserved the futures that were not taken from them in the specific, calculated way that they were taken. They are owed, at minimum, the insistence that their names survive the story that swallowed them, that the record places them at the center where they belong, that the long attention this case has received be understood as being, finally and in its most important dimension, about them. There is a particular kind of investigative grief that the people who worked the early Bundy cases carried with them for the rest of their careers, a grief that is different from the grief of the victims' families, but that is nonetheless real and lasting. The grief of having been very close to the truth and not quite been able to reach it in time. Detective Robert Keppel of the King County Sheriff's Office was one of those investigators, a young detective in 1974 who was thrust into one of the most complex and disturbing cases in the region's history without the frameworks or the tools that would have helped him understand what he was dealing with. He has spoken extensively over the decades since about the experience of working the case, about the specific feeling of pursuing something that kept moving just ahead of you, of accumulating evidence that refused to cohere into an identifiable person until the person had moved on to another state and another jurisdiction and another series of murders. Keppel returned to Bundy after the arrest, after the conviction, after the death sentence, and he brought with him on those visits to Florida State Prison the specific weight of the years he had spent trying to catch what he had not caught fast enough. His conversations with Bundy were professional and methodical, aimed at recovering information that might help identify additional victims and at building the psychological understanding that the FBI's broader research project required. But in the accounts he has given of those conversations, there is something personal alongside the professional, some reckoning with the specific experience of sitting across from the person who had occupied so much of his working life, who had been in some sense the central mystery of his career, now reduced to a man in prison clothes in a room that smelled of disinfectant and institutional food. Bundy was, Keppel reported, forthcoming in a way that was useful but never entirely comfortable. He would provide details that checked out, that led to remains or to corroboration of other evidence, and then he would retreat into the analytic detachment that characterized his self-presentation, discussing the violence as if reviewing a research project. He appeared to understand that the information he was providing had a currency, that it was the last remaining thing he had that anyone wanted, and he managed it accordingly, releasing it carefully, maintaining the dynamic of exchange for as long as the appeals process gave him leverage to maintain it. When the appeals ran out, the information accelerated. In the final weeks, he was naming locations and describing events with a specificity that investigators had not gotten from him across the many preceding months of conversation, a change in pattern that was entirely consistent with the psychology the researchers had been studying, the use of information as control, released only when the cost of withholding it was no longer bearable. The families of his victims had no equivalent of this release. There was no moment at which what had happened to their loved ones became clear and settled and complete, at which the full account was finally rendered and could be absorbed and grieved and in some sense put away. Some families received, in those final weeks, information about their daughters and sisters that they had not had before, information about specific locations or specific events that allowed them to finally know what had happened, or part of what had happened. Others did not receive such information because Bundy did not confess to every case investigators suspected him of, because the appeals process ended before some conversations were had, because the deal-making and the delay and the calculation that characterized every interaction he had with authority extended into those final months and limited what was ultimately disclosed. The families have continued, in the decades since, to live with what they were given. Grief of this specific kind does not diminish on a predictable schedule, and the complicating factors of an unresolved case, of a killer who became a cultural celebrity, of a continuing stream of documentaries and books and series that revisit the violence in ways that reopen rather than close, make the grief's geography particularly complex. Several family members have spoken publicly over the years about the experience of watching the cultural machine process the story of the man who killed someone they loved, about the specific difficulty of watching that machine center the perpetrator while the victims remain peripheral, about the disconnect between the world's sustained fascination with Ted Bundy and the sustained indifference of that same world to the specific people whose deaths produced the story that fascination feeds on. This tension is not resolvable within the constraints of any single documentary or account. It is structural, built into the way the story was originally told and retold, built into the asymmetry of documentation between perpetrator and victims that the historical record preserves. What can be done, and what should be done, is to name the asymmetry clearly and to insist, in every engagement with the case, that the victims' names and the victims' stories are the moral priority that every other element of the case should serve rather than displace. The criminal profiling work that the Bundy case catalyzed has, over the 50 years since, produced a body of knowledge about violent sexual predators that has materially improved the investigative response to this category of crime. The FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, which grew from the Behavioral Science Unit's work, developed classification systems and interview methodologies and case linkage analysis protocols that are now standard elements of the investigative toolkit for serious violent crime across American law enforcement. The understanding of what the profiling literature calls the organized offender, the category of perpetrator characterized by planning and victim selection and operational control, and the specific social intelligence that allows them to approach and disarm their targets, derives in significant part from the study of cases like Bundy's, from the patient and difficult work of sitting with people who had committed terrible things and asking the questions that needed asking. This work is not glamorous, and it is not comfortable, and the people who do it carry its weight with them in ways that are not always visible in the formal reports and the published research. Robert Ressler, one of the FBI agents who conducted the foundational serial killer interviews from which the profiling methodology developed, described the cumulative effect of years of this work as a kind of occupational heaviness, a sustained exposure to the worst that people are capable of that does not harden so much as it changes the texture of daily life, makes certain ordinary pleasures slightly harder to access, makes the normal world slightly more difficult to inhabit, with the unconsidered ease that people who have not spent years with this material can take for granted. Keppel, Ressler, Hackmeyer, Douglas, the investigators and researchers who built the modern understanding of violent sexual predation, partly from their encounters with Bundy, all carry in their accounts some version of this heaviness, some acknowledgement that what they looked at closely left marks. The marks that the case left on American culture more broadly are of a different character, more diffuse, more mediated by narrative and entertainment, more ambivalent in their moral register. The true crime genre that now occupies such a significant portion of the American entertainment landscape, from podcasts to streaming series to best-selling books, owes a great deal of its current form to the Bundy case and to the choices made in covering it in real time in the late 1970s and the 1980s. The decision to televise his trial established the precedent that criminal proceedings could be entertainment, that the drama of murder and defense and prosecution could be consumed with the engagement that other forms of dramatic content produced. The subsequent decades of true crime programming, from the earliest documentary treatments of his case through the Netflix series and the Hollywood films that appeared in the 2010s, have built on that precedent in ways whose implications for the culture's relationship to violence and justice and victimhood are still being worked out. Some of what has come from this cultural engagement is genuinely valuable. Public understanding of how serial killers are identified and apprehended, of how criminal investigation works, of the systemic vulnerabilities that predators exploit, has been deepened by decades of serious true crime journalism and documentary work that treats its subjects with the gravity they deserve and that uses narrative skill in the service of genuine understatement rather than mere entertainment. The best of the genre does what journalism has always done at its best, which is to illuminate hidden or misunderstood aspects of the world in ways that produce not only understanding but response, that change what audiences know and therefore change what they demand of the institutions responsible for the public's safety. What is less valuable, and what the Bundy case has contributed to disproportionately, is the template for the glamorization of the perpetrator, the centering of the killer's psychology and appearance and story in ways that serve the audience's appetite for darkness while displacing the moral weight that belongs to the victims. The romantic framing that has attached itself to Bundy in particular, the persistent cultural interest in his looks and his charm, and the dark appeal of the contrast between surface and depth, is a distortion that the victims' families have protested repeatedly, and that serious researchers have consistently pushed back against. It is also, unfortunately, a distortion that has proven highly resistant to correction, because it is built into the architecture of the story's original telling, and because it responds to something in the audience that is real and human, even if it is not admirable, the fascination with the face that conceals catastrophe, the desire to understand how something can look like safety and be its opposite. The face itself, his face, remains in the cultural memory with an immediacy that the faces of his victims do not, and this is the final injustice of the asymmetry, the most basic and least correctable form of it. Linda Healy's face exists in photographs, in the images that were circulated when she was reported missing, and in the family photographs that have appeared in accounts of the case. It is a specific and individual face, the face of a person, and it deserves the same quality of attention and recognition that his face commands so easily and so persistently. The same is true of each of the other women, each specific face representing a specific person who existed fully and who deserved to go on existing. The correction to the imbalance of attention is not to erase his face from the record, but to insist, every time it appears, that it appears alongside the faces of the people he killed, that the full accounting of what he was includes and centers the accounting of what he did and to whom he did it. Ted Bundy wanted, as all narcissists do, to be the most important thing in the room. He wanted, as the performance of his own trial demonstrated, to be looked at and listened to and engaged with, to remain at the center of the story even as the story became the story of his crimes rather than the story of his promise. He got what he wanted, in a sense and on a scale that should make us uncomfortable, because the desire he had and the cultural machinery that fed it reflect each other in ways that illuminate something unflattering about both. The correction is simple to describe and difficult to execute, but it is the only correction that matters: to look, finally and with sustained attention, at the faces that were not centered, at the names that appear in his confession and in the case file and in the missing persons reports and in the newspaper photographs taken at the time, when they were still alive and their futures were still ahead of them, and the autumn of 1974 was still just an autumn, not yet a threshold. To look at those faces and to hold, against the gravity of everything the culture has built around the man who killed them, the understanding that this is where the story lives, and always has lived, and always should have lived, in the specific weight of specific loss, in the 30 and more names, in the mornings those women had, and the mornings they did not have, and the full, particular, irreplaceable presence they brought to the world, before the world was made less by their absence. That is the story. That is the whole of it. Everything else is context, and context is important, but it is not the center. The center is them.